Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 207. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of The Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with authors M.M. Downing and S.J. Waugh about their new middle grade series, The Adventures of the Flash Gang. This series centers around an 11-year-old boy named Lewis Carter, who was orphaned and left to fend for himself during the Great Depression in 1930s Pittsburgh. But Lewis, unlike other orphans, has some physical challenges that make it difficult for him to pull off the same stunts as the others. So Lewis resorts to science to help him in his plight. He becomes so successful at it that people assume there's an entire gang at work. Pretty soon, Lewis and his Flash Gang become the most notorious food thieves in all of Pittsburgh. He also foils a Nazi plot as well. Episode 1, Exploding Experiment, and Episode 2, Treasonous Tycoon, are on bookshelves now. In this episode, I'll chat with Melanie and Sandra about their writing journey, how their initial research for this book led them to decide on Pittsburgh as their setting, and why it was important for them to write this series for the middle grade audience, as well as a few other things coming up. Melanie Downing and Sandra Waugh, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
We're very happy to be here.
I thought what we could do today is start by talking about your new series, The Adventures of the Flash Gang. I think what we'll do is start with sort of a general introduction to the series. Melanie, perhaps let's start with you. If you don't mind, can you give us an overview of this series and help us understand what the spark was for writing it?
Sure. So the series takes place in the Great Depression in 1930, the 30s in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And our spark for, I'm going to talk about both together. Our spark for the series was we both were really taken with the idea of orphans. And we wanted an American setting, but we wanted something evocative and atmospheric. And in our research, we really led us to Pittsburgh in the 30s. And so we set our group of orphans there, and we designed this world where they have no parents, they have no adult figures, but they're still taking care of themselves on the street. We coined the term streeter for our series, which is our word for being an orphan, but being on your own and being the sole provider for yourself. Sandra, do you want to chime in there?
Yeah, I would say basically, in a nutshell, our story or our series is about a street orphan and his ragtag crew who foil a pro-Nazi plot in 1935 Pittsburgh. So as Melanie said, we were taken with orphans. We wanted an American setting, but something that was very evocative. We're both inspired by Dickensian settings. So Pittsburgh in the 1930s actually lent itself very much to that. And the rest we felt our way through. We had lots of different beginnings to this story. As anyone who's reading the story will realize that the term flash takes a huge part of the book. And we weren't even sure what that was when we started, but we kind of found our way through, partly by writing, talking, and researching.
And what led you to Pittsburgh? I mean, are either of you from there? Does it have sentimental value?
Not at all.
It has sentimental value now. But neither of us are from Pittsburgh. We found Pittsburgh essentially on our search for, we were just very taken with the idea of Dickensian London, that grimy, gritty, the world of Oliver Twist, which we both just as kids loved reading about. And still today, we both as adult readers love books set there. But we didn't want to do, Dickens is Dickens. We wanted our own setting. And we definitely wanted to do the Great Depression. We thought that was a fun time to talk about kids. And we found Pittsburgh, which at the time was dominated with steel mills and had the sort of Sandra's favorite detail about Pittsburgh during that time was that it was so smoggy that the streetlights were on during the day.
Yeah.
And so that gave us just this amazing Pittsburgh is just, we're both madly in love with Pittsburgh now. It's got the three converging rivers. It's set in these ridges where there are literal wooden staircases built into the hills where you can get around. And we thought, what better setting to have orphans kind of sneaking around the shadows and hiding in plain sight and having getaway routes. So we settled on Pittsburgh because it gave us such a rich playground to play with these characters.
And also, I would say, when you think of shantytowns in Pittsburgh, it was the big one in Pittsburgh. It was actually when we set our first story, which is 1935, Shantytown had been destroyed. But for a long time, all up and down Liberty Avenue, particularly close to a church that was there that was very popular, St. Patrick's, there was a huge shantytown. So again, back in the Depression, you can imagine a lot of homeless people just fending for themselves. And then we throw our orphans into the mix. We have, as Melanie said, the steep bridges to run up and down, the rivers to sort of lock them in and also add incredible atmosphere. We have the smog coming in, the background of the steel mills just churning out steel and so forth. There are the bridges. There's so many bridges, even more than there are now, that we're crossing all the rivers between Pittsburgh and so forth. So there was just a lot to play with as
There
writers.
were railroad tracks
Running up through the city. It's changed a lot from what we can tell. We have an old map that we started with, and in comparison, a lot has changed. But again, as writers, it was like a smorgasbord to play with.
How much time did you spend researching this before you sat down to write? Was that a lengthy process, or did you end up researching as you were writing?
Researching as we wrote.
Really?
It was concurrent for sure.
Oh,
Definitely.
really?
Yeah.
Did you end up having to make significant changes to what you were writing as a result of what your research uncovered?
I wouldn't say that it was significant changes. It was more, oh, guess what? This church burned down in 1935. We can use that. It was more like this fantastic discovery process of real life events that we could, use for dramatic purposes in our book. So, if there was a chapter or if there was the big picture stuff, like the church burning down or the river flooding, but then there was the little picture stuff too, like what diner would have been there, how was food sold there? Like if we need a character to go get, a piece of bread, how would he have gotten that there? Wouldn't you say, Sandra, that both things kind of fed each other?
Yeah, and obviously we made up some things just because we're writers and we took a little bit of license, but it's rooted in truth, I'd say. And yeah, the small details. I think one of the most fun discoveries, which I didn't know, but obviously people who grew up around Pittsburgh, was Brown's Dump, which was this huge place where all the steel companies just dumped all their slag. And you could see it lit up at night. I mean, the fires were burning there 24/7, and finding that and using it as a scene in our story was just so much fun. So that we had never heard of until we actually started writing.
Hmm. Well, let's talk about your main character and his gang.
Okay.
Maybe Melanie, start us off. What do we need to know about Lewis?
So Lewis Carter he's 12 years old in the first book, or 11 in the first book, Sandra?
Yes,
He's
11.
11 in the first book. He's 12 in the second book. The first book is called Exploding Experiment. And so we created this idea of how would orphans with no parents, whose parents maybe had been victims of the Depression, had no income. There were stories of, families having to give away their children because they couldn't feed them. We started with how would an orphan survive on his own? And then we quickly realized it would require resourcefulness and agility and courage. And then we were like, well, how can we create some obstacles for that? So we created a character, Lewis, who he has damaged lungs. He can't run fast. He is not agile. He is completely on his own. He doesn't know what happened to his father. His father went out one day and never came back. And he has had to figure out how to provide for himself and feed himself without having all the skills that the other streeter orphans have, which is an ability to like slip their little fingers into a pocket or dash into a market, grab something and dash out. He can't do any of those things. So that is Lewis Carter, and his the way he makes up for that is with his brain. And do you want to continue, Sandra?
Oh,
Oh no, okay. I can keep going.
with his brain, yes. Well, yes, he's very clever. And so we gave him these impediments, these physical impediments that allowed him to kind of hone his cleverness. And so he has taken some remainders of an experiment his father was working on and created a flash, which is harmless, but creates such a brilliant, dazzling smoke of light that he can pinch food under that guise. So he's become rather famous for that.
So using science, he has created a cover for himself that he mixes these ingredients that he's determined will create the proper amount of light without any sort of damage. It's not going to hurt anybody. It's just going to blind them for a minute and kind of dazzle them. And then he can sneak in and get his food and sneak out.
Okay, well, that sort of leads me into wanting to know a bit more about the books. You have two out in the series. Let's talk about episode 1, Exploding Experiment. So let's start there without too many spoilers. Sandra, can you give us sort of an overview of what we would find in book 1?
Well, we find Lewis on his own for, I think, 113 days or so, having had his father disappear on him. So he was kicked out of his walk-up where he lived with his father and has found an empty, abandoned factory to live in. And he is, as we described, making ends meet by setting these flashes so that he can pinch food, and little guilt has him give some of that food to the St. Patrick's, as we've referred to before, the St. Patrick's Church soup kitchen. And then he has enough for himself. He's managed to become quite famous as this flash gang that everybody's wondering about. And so people imagine it's an entire gang. They imagine it's a mob, the mob, anybody but a single little boy doing these flashes. And so that notoriety has also caught the attention of some bad people, and they are looking for this flash material. And he is, I don't know how far I should go in, but he's kidnapped. And when he's kidnapped, he then meets as his rescuer our other main character, Pearl Alice Clavel. And together, they not only escape his kidnapping, but they proceed to combine forces and solve not only a mystery, but foil, as we said, a Nazi plot that's taking place in the city.
So rather resourceful is our Lewis. Okay.
He's incredibly resourceful.
Well, Melanie, maybe introduce us to the latest installment, episode 2, Treasonous Tycoon.
Sure. So Treasonous Tycoon is our second episode. It takes place a year later. The first book really focuses on Lewis and Pearl, and they have their other friends who are around. The second book really focuses on they've now become a gang at the end of well, I shouldn't say that, but they are now, I don't want to give it away, but there are multiple kids now living in Lewis's abandoned factory, and they are having to learn how to live as a group and share their resources. And get along as a found family, really. And as with any family, there are some stresses between the kids over, Lewis, how to set the flash, when to set the flash, what to use the flash for. There's disagreements about that. And then while they are, exploring this family dynamic, the orphans, they're also still pursuing the bad guys who appeared in the first book. And they're trying to track down who those people are and find a way to bring them to justice. And over the course of that, they stumble once again onto a larger plot that they feel determined it's their job. Pearl especially feels quite determined that it is their duty to stop it.
What are the plans for the series then? Two installments out. Do you have outlines or ideas for further books? Do you have a target, the number of books you want to put out, or is it just one at a time at this point?
There's one installment left, which is book three.
Okay.
So it's a trilogy.
Okay.
And we've actually just finished it. We just sent in our proofreader edits and back cover copy. So now it's just a matter of waiting another year for that one to come out. We set it up in a way, I mean, this is more about writing than the story, but I think our characters age in from book one to book two. And if we sort of felt that it was an appropriate ending after three books, that how they grow, how they've aged, that it ceases to become a middle grade story. And we didn't want to keep spinning our wheels in Pittsburgh, talking about orphans running around the streets. So we sort of had a clear idea of three being the series.
Why middle grade? I mean, it's certainly an interesting idea in general, right? Setting a story in the Depression in Pittsburgh, orphans, etc. But why middle grade? It could have been an adult story. It could have been young adult. What was so attractive about the middle grade audience that made you want to write for them?
Kids are so good at getting out of scrapes.
Better than
That's what I
adults
love.
usually.
I mean, I think Melanie and I, and this is again more about writing than the story itself, but I think middle grade fiction is such a foundation for our sensibilities, how we relate to things. And so I happen to love middle grade. I think it's just so much fun. The kids are resourceful, the plots are extraordinary, they can be a little fantastical. Children, and as readers, children just allow for everything. I love that.
Melanie, why make the main character a boy? Was he always a boy from the initial conception, or did you make a decision that the main character needed to be male?
No, that's such a great question. When we were finding this story and finding our characters, we were talking about this the other day, that initially there really wasn't a single main character. It was a gang of kids, and there were different kids, and some were girls, some were boys. And then as we started to tease it out and figure out the best way to tell the story, it really kind of emerged that this one character was the best way into the world. And he just was always a boy. He was always Lewis. He was always the one with the brain. Like I think the initial conception, there was a gang of kids and there was one very smart one. And he just kind of emerged as our entry point into the story. And then we do both sort of consider that there's two lead characters. So Lewis is our main boy, but Pearl is every bit as much of the protagonist in the story. And we actually decided to tell primarily from Lewis's point of view because Pearl was such a shining star of a character. She was one of those characters that shows up in your creative process that threatens to just take over the whole thing. She was so vibrant and easy to write, and just by nature of how she is, it was very easy to get carried away with her. So Lewis allowed us to focus the story, to focus the plot, to allow Pearl her moments of making everything so entertaining. But he's our straight man. He's the one that, he's the one that anchors the whole thing.
And Sandra, what has been the reaction from readers to the story? Beta readers, editors, kids reading the book, adults reading the book. What kind of feedback have you received?
Pretty great feedback, I would say. We are gratified that both books so far in the series have gotten starred Kirkus reviews. So that was really exciting for us. What I like best is that we found that a lot of boys like the story.
Mm.
And I think so,
Adult and children. Like
and
it's
I think,
resonated with adult male reviewers and
yeah,
readers too.
Hmm.
exactly. And I think sometimes I think boys can be, not difficult readers, but ones that are not as enthusiastic about reading. And so to find that we created a character and a story that drew them in was very exciting for us. I also am going to say that there was a family I know that the father and son were reading the story together at night, like bedtime story, and that kind of sharing is just wonderful. So we're really pleased.
Yeah. It must be gratifying to know that you've gotten it right to write a male character and have readers respond to it like that.
It was a
I
pleasant surprise, I think.
Yeah, and I personally think when you have a character, a hero who has drawbacks, whether they're emotional or, everybody's got their Achilles heel. And I think Lewis's was very relatable. That just he's sort of puny and not as strong as others, so he makes up for it in other ways.
Yeah. Well, I'm very curious to learn how you two met. How did this writing duo come about?
We
Melanie?
met in a writers group.
Okay.
We met in a writers group where there were two other writers in the group. Two were writing adult fiction. Sandra and I were each working on young adult books. And that writers group, Sandra, how long did that last? Many years. And
Mhm.
then for a variety of reasons, it kind of went away. Yeah, I think I had a baby during that time, and so I was focused on other things, and I had not really been writing because I was mothering. And Sandra was the one who called me up and said, I really have this. I've never written middle grade, and I really want to because I love it so much, and I know you're not free enough to write your own book. So what if we pitched in together and tried our stab at a middle grade book as sort of a writing experiment? And I think she was, trying to find her own pathway onto the world of middle grade, and was very generous in bringing me along since she knew I was stuck at home with two babies. So that is how we met. We met as a writers group, and we forged our partnership because Sandra asked me to. It was one of the best questions I was ever asked.
Well, I would also chime in that a knowing Melanie, I wanted to write with her. I just felt her imagination and her abilities would just be so much fun to work with. And I think we also just shared a love, as I said before, about middle grade, just how much we both loved middle grade fiction, how much it affected who we are today.
If I
We
could
love,
interject, we both loved reading as middle graders.
yes,
So we both
yes.
Wow.
had that experience as being, a 10-year-old kid who loved to read.
Looking for sweeping, epic tales and brave kids and fascinating backdrops. So we just wanted to bring that to the fore.
So, how did the books get finished? I mean, it's one idea to sit and talk about great ideas for the story and maybe share some research, but how did you actually get the words down, polish them, and get it out in the world?
How
Melanie, you
much
want to talk
time do
about
you have? I don't know. I don't know how to answer that. How did we do it? Like there was,
I, you know,
I don't
I
know. You
I think
stumped us.
yeah, we weren't writing at that time. We weren't writing to a deadline. We were just writing for
Right. That's a
fun of
good
it.
point.
Uh,
And
So the
so
first book we took our time with, and
yeah,
I guess
we
we were just so committed because we loved the story. And at some point we really committed ourselves to sticking to a schedule. And again, Sandra was absolutely amazing at that part because I can easily float away and float off. And she was very good about keeping us to deadlines. We had a weekly phone call that we set up and we still stick to many years later. We will check in and then we'll give each other, Sandra calls them our marching orders. We'll say, okay, you're going to work on fixing these pages. I'm going to work on outlining the next chapter, and we'll chat again next week. And at some point, we really love our characters, which sounds cliche, but we really loved them and felt that there was something special with the books that we owed it to them, to our characters, to finish and
Yeah.
to see what happened then.
Yeah, I know how we began. I mean, we began by talking and then starting to write and throwing out tons of pages. I would say there are at least 100 pages in of different characters and formats and settings and, inside Pittsburgh, outside Pittsburgh.
I would say hundreds,
Yeah, and
hundreds.
they got tossed until finally we had Lewis and then Pearl. And then from there we sort of found our way through the story. We weren't really sure exactly how things were going to happen, but I'm I say to Melanie, I'm one of those writers that feels like the story's out there, and if you just take time to listen to the out there-ness, the story comes to you and as it should be told. And so that's the way I sort of see it happening. Melanie is extremely good at creating structure. So she can tell if I'm finding some story that's wafting up there.
She's listening to ether and I'm looking at blueprints.
Yeah,
That's basically
exactly.
how it works.
But that's how it happened. And then I think then, when we got that far along with the story, then the rest just seemed kind of obvious how it ended. And then we left it open, not even imagining we'd have a trilogy, but we left it open that there could be another story or two. And suddenly there was.
What are your goals now? I'm curious. Do you have plans to continue writing together once this series, this trilogy is done? And do you have individual goals, things that you are writing on your own? Melanie, how about we start with you?
Sure. So we both have our own individual goals. And I think when we were in the thick of finishing up book three, we were both like, oh my gosh, how could we ever do this again? And now that we've finished the draft of for book three, we both have kind of been reaching out to each other and saying, well, I kind of have this idea of how we could continue with these characters in a different set of books. They would not be middle grade books. And we've been writing together now for so many years that we have such a good, we're just good at it together, if I may say that. We have a system and it works. And so we definitely will write together again. We don't know if it would be middle grade next or a YA next, but there's more books. I think we both really love the idea of being historical middle grade writers. There aren't that many of them. I think historical fiction can be a tough nut to crack for a young reader. And I think we both feel very lucky that our books are working in that way, and we definitely will continue. And then Sandra is a beautiful, beautiful writer in her own regard, and she has about 25 stories working at any time on paper, and so she's definitely doing that. Go ahead, Sandra. Talk about
Yeah,
yourself.
that can.
Tell everyone about your ideas.
No, no, no. I absolutely agree with Melanie. I think if I was the one that called Melanie and said, let's write together, then I'm really glad I did because I have really enjoyed it. I don't think it's always easy to write with a co-author because two creative people can butt heads or have different ways of doing things, but we found what our strengths are and they seem to sort of jive. I might have a strength in one thing and Melanie will have a strength that balances it. And grateful for that. And we both were writing other tales. I know we've both published YAs, young adult books, and just sort of happened to come to this middle grade story separately. And so I think we do have other YAs and maybe sort of semi YA / adult stories in the making that have been put on the back burner so we could finish these stories. And I do like writing more than one story at a time. It's how my brain works. So I hope I keep writing alone and with Melanie because I would like to continue.
Good, good. Well, if people want to keep up to date with you guys, find out when you're having new releases out together that you've co-authored and then maybe individually, where can they go to find you? Melanie, how about you?
Well, we're on all the usual suspects of social media. We have a Facebook page at Downing Waugh. We have a Twitter account, Downing Waugh. Instagram is Downing Waugh. It's our last names together. And our website is www.downingwaugh.com. And so all of our upcoming projects and appearances and things like that can be found there. And we love emails and we love hearing from readers. So you can always reach us by email at downingwaugh@gmail.com.
Mm-hmm.
Good. And
Did
Sandra,
I forget anything? I don't think I did.
No, I think that's Instagram, I think also Downing Waugh.
Instagram, yeah.
so Sandra, if people want to purchase a copy of either episode 1 or episode 2, where can they go to buy them?
Well, I would say if they go to the Regal House, which is sort of the mother publishing group, Regal House Publishing, they will find our books there. That's our publisher loves us to mention that first. Obviously, it's on Amazon as well. You can certainly request it from Barnes and Noble or other independent bookstores.
You can order it online at bnn.com.
At line 2, yeah. Yeah. So Regal House, BNN, Amazon, usual suspects.
The usual
also.
suspects.
And then we would be remiss if we didn't mention that if you live near an independent children's bookstore, please walk in there and order it.
Yes.
That's right. They'll always be happy to get you.
Yes, they will get you a copy, and it's important to support those kinds of brick and mortar stores.
Yes.
Exactly.
Agreed. Well, Melanie, Sandra, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast, and I want to wish you luck with the adventures of the Flash Gang. We'll look forward to episode 3 coming out. So congratulations on everything you both have accomplished, and best of luck with the rest of your writing journeys.
Thank you so much.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.